I'm always reading back of the label, looking for the protein, looking for how much fat, how much carbs, but the food matrix is something entirely different. So can we start maybe just by way of background, what is the food matrix and why do we need to be thinking about this in addition to, macronutrients, total calories, etc.?
So, in simple terms, the food matrix is the structure of a food. And it's really important because I think that we now realize as nutrition scientists that we can no longer think of food in terms of its nutrients, in terms of its fat, protein, fiber, carbohydrate. We know that actually what impacts how healthful a food is so much more than that. It's the thousands of other chemicals, and we know that food on average has about 25,000 chemicals. And these are, bioactive chemicals like polyphenols, etc. But we also know these chemicals and these nutrients are encapsulated within a very complex structure, which is this food matrix. And every food has a different structure. And this structure modulates the health effects of these nutrients. And the reason it's so relevant now is because processing changes the food matrix. It changes the structure of food, sometimes beneficially, but mostly unfavorably, to have detrimental health effects. And I think as well, Stephanie, what blows my mind in terms of the research I've done around food matrix and food structure is the fact that you can have two foods that have exactly the same back of pack labeling, exactly the same ingredients, exactly the same nutrients, but just differ in terms of their structure. And by just differing in terms of their structure can result in an entirely different impact on our health.
Is this like the difference between maybe a whole apple and applesauce? Is that would that be like a comparison in terms of like it has the exact same ingredients, but it's just a different structure? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great example. And actually, it's a really pertinent example for us in nutrition science because there was a study that was published in 1977 in the Lancet. It was actually one of the first nutrition studies ever to be published in the Lancet because nutrition science has always been considered kind of the poor man's science, still is sometimes. And in this study, they looked at how we process whole apples versus apple puree, where all they did was mix up the apples so it had exactly the same nutrients versus apple juice, which did actually have the fiber removed. And what they found was that it had a different impact in terms of the speed at which we're eating. So you ate the calories 2 to 3 times more quickly when you had the apple puree versus the whole apple. It changed your hunger levels. So you were hungry a lot more quickly after having the apple puree. You felt less full, and it also changed those glucose dynamics. So the rate at which your blood sugar increased and the rate at which it dropped. And we've since, in my own research, done very similar studies where we've looked at how feeding nuts or feeding oats that have either been fed whole or finely ground can impact how many calories you absorb from that food, how fast you metabolize that food, and knock-on effects on hunger and satiety.
Yeah, and anyone who's ever made nut butter at home, you realize how much nuts go into one tablespoon, let's say, of peanut butter or almond butter or whatever nut butter. How much nuts actually go into that. And even the experience of, apple versus, apple puree or nut versus nut butter, it's an entirely different sensorial experience too, right? There's like like for apples, you have to chew and, you have to chew however many times before you swallow. And then there's like different textures. It's almost an entirely different experience. Would you agree?
Oh, totally. There's different number of chews, there's different speeding of eating, there's different texture. And we know that texture's really, really important. There's some fabulous research coming out now from a group in the Netherlands looking at how texture can impact the speed at which you're eating. And so again, going back to food processing and ultra processed food, there's been so much emphasis on ultra processed food is bad for us because it's got this additive or it's got this emulsifier. But actually what we know is that processing impacts the structure of the food to change the texture of the food, and changing that texture can have a big impact on our health. And there's work that's done that's found that changing the texture of a food is probably one of the most important things in terms of how food processing impacts how much energy we consume. And that if you eat your food really fast, which is what happens when you have soft textured food that's been heavily processed. You eat a lot more calories, up to about 50% more calories than if you were to eat a similar meal that has a harder texture.
So I'm thinking about all the women that are like, but wait, I have a smoothie every morning and I throw blueberries and spinach and I throw all the things in there. Are smoothies, because of, things have been ground up and it's in liquid form and it's very easy to sort of throw back a lot of it. Would you prefer someone have the whole blueberries and maybe the sauteed spinach in the egg omelet versus throwing it all in a smoothie?
So look, Stephanie, I think we have a huge problem in the UK, in the US, in Canada, worldwide, where most people aren't consuming enough fiber, aren't consuming enough plant-based foods, aren't consuming enough fruits and vegetables. If a smoothie is the way for you to eat more of these helpful foods, absolutely it's going to improve your health. However, if we were to want to go for optimization, then I think it's better to eat the whole food, because you will eat it at a more healthy pace, because I think it's easy to glug down that smoothie and therefore overconsume. But if the smoothie is basically lots of fruits and vegetables and healthy ingredients, then it's still going to be beneficial. But I think there's some work that we did with almond nuts that's a great example of showing how you can have two foods with identical ingredients, but actually just by grinding them or processing them, like you would, for example, with a smoothie, can change how much calories are released and how much you absorb. So we did the study where we fed individual either whole almonds or we fed them really finely ground almonds using industrial processes. So not the kind of grinding that you would typically do at home, but using industrial kind of grinding. And we fed these to individuals. And what we found was that there was a huge difference in the amount of energy that people were absorbing from the whole almonds versus the ground almonds. And this has also been shown by other researchers, where we see that there's about a 20 to 30% difference in terms of how much energy you absorb versus what's on the back of pack labeling. So on the back of pack labeling, typically it says that a portion of almonds has about 160 calories. But if you consume those almonds as whole almonds, you actually only absorb about 120 calories. If you consume them as finely ground almonds using these industrial processes, you will absorb all of the calories. And this is because of that food structure, because of that food matrix. So almonds, just like all plant foods, have thousands and thousands of cells making them up. These cells are tiny. So for example, in nuts, they're smaller than a grain of sand. So when you chew your food, you're swallowing particles that are normally about, say, 1 millimeter. So within those 1 millimeter particles, you've got thousands and thousands of these cells that are still intact, that have these rigid cell walls, that within these rigid cell walls, you've got all the fat and other nutrients still encapsulated, still trapped. Now, some of it is digested as it passes through the gut, but actually a lot comes out the other end. So anyone who's got kids who's listening to this, who will have, I'm sure, doubtless time looked at their poo and have given them nuts, you'll be aware, or even from your own poo, that after you eat nuts, you see whole particles of nuts in your poo. And that's because of this cell structure, because of the matrix, because of the structure of the almonds. If, however, you finely grind them, so you break up the cell walls, you're releasing all of the fat. Therefore, you're absorbing all of the fat and all of the nutrients. But Stephanie, it's a double-edged sword, because for people who want to reduce their energy intake, who want to go on a weight loss diet, yes, it's beneficial that the fact that whole almonds are less calorific, less energy dense when you eat them, because a lot's coming out the other end. But what you've got to also remember is there's lots of other nutrients that are within those cells, like vitamin E, for example, and other micronutrients that we know are also excreted together with the fat. And so I think, therefore, it's oversimplifying things by saying, oh my gosh, you mustn't blend your fruit or you mustn't blend your nuts. I think you need to look at an individual basis.
Yeah, and to your point around the smoothies, it's like, if that's how you're getting the vegetables in and it's convenient and it works for you, wonderful. Like I've said many times on the show, the ideal time to work out, if you look at the literature, is somewhere between 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Your core body temperature, has risen, you've likely had a meal, you've lubricated the joints, but not everybody can work out at that time.
Yeah.
I myself cannot work out I work out usually somewhere between 5 to 7 in the morning before the school run and all the things.
Wow.
So
Well done, you.
yeah, well, it's like otherwise it doesn't get done, right? So that's what works for me. It's not ideal, but I still get her done, right?
Yeah.
And in the same vein, I think what you're saying is, hey, the literature is suggesting that whole foods, you're going to have this whole food matrix where maybe there's a reduction in terms of the total calories that you absorb, but you're also losing out on some of the vitamins and things that are encapsulated in these cells. So it's like you have to figure out, I mean, I think the ideal is like whole foods, yes. And we can also have our nut butters as long as, we're thinking about portion control, let's say, and our smoothies if they work for us.
Absolutely. Totally agree with that. You know what? As a mum of teenage kids, if they're happy to have a smoothie every morning, I would be singing from the rooftops with joy.
You're like, where's my award? Where's my mum award? Because it's great, right? I love
Sadly,
that.
they don't, but if they would, I
if
would
they did hand them out, you would get one. I love that.